Okay, so we pointed out the problems with our set methods. They're not doing any data validity checks, and so people can pass in values that don't, that are invalid, and you'll end up getting a time object that is not really a time object. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to do something that I call failing silently. Really, the best way to do this is to throw exceptions, but that's a later topic. So all we're going to do is we're going to check, and if the input is invalid, then we're not going to set the value to the private data member. So that's what I call failing silently. You may say, well, why don't we output something? Well, people don't always, there's not always a person there to see an error message. So let's just start with our set hours. And as we know, hours can be 0 and up to 23. So we have to check to see if new hours is greater or equal to 0 and new hours has to be less than or equal to 23. Now, if that's true, then the value that the programmer passed in is valid, and I can set it to my private data member. Just like that. I'm going to do the same thing with set minutes. Well, minutes, new minutes, has to be greater than or equal to 0, and it has to be what? Less than or equal to 59. If this is true, then I can make the assignment. I know that I have a valid value for minutes, and I can say that minutes is equal to new minutes. Just like that. Now what I need to do is I need to go back and I need to change my constructor, and I need to change the inner method so that they use these new implementations. So here's how I'm going to do that. So the explicit constructor is pretty simple. So someone's going to pass in new hours. And there's a subtlety here. And we wouldn't have to worry about this if we were throwing exceptions, but because we're failing silently, there's something that we have to do. Now I want to make sure I perform the integrity checks. So I'm going to pass new hours to the set method, to the appropriate set method, and I'm going to do the same thing for minutes. Just like that. Now here's the subtlety. This is a constructor, so when it executes, hours and minutes are unassigned. They have no values. Well, if one or both of these set methods fails silently, then that means that the private data members will be left unassigned. So I have to give them first legitimate default values before I call set hours and set minutes using these integrity checks. So I can do that by assigning them to 0. Another thing I could do is I can either do that through direct assignment, or I could actually call the set hours and set minutes methods by passing in 0. So why don't I just do that? So we're going to set hours to 0, and then I'm going to set minutes to 0. And now if one or both of these set methods fails because these are incorrect values, I know that I'll at least have 0 in those private data members. Now for the enter method, things are a little trickier. And I would also need to do the same thing for the read method. I'm not going to refactor read, but that can be something that you can do. So one thing I don't want to do, so if we go back and we take a look at this implementation, I can't read directly into hours, because if I read directly into hours and I've read an invalid value, then I've lost. I'm trying to avoid storing invalid values into my private data members. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare some local variables, and then I'm going to pass them to my set methods. So that's how I'm going to implement my new enter method. And just for consistency, let's say that I call these new hours and new minutes. And I still need my character. Now I can read in to new hours. I can read in my character. And I can read in my new minutes. So these are all stored locally. Now what happens if CH is not a colon? Good question. One of the things you could do is you could set the fail bit on CN. Maybe you don't make these assignments. Maybe we should throw an exception. So there are a bunch of different ways you could handle that. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to check to see and make sure that CH is equal to a colon. And if it is, then I'll go ahead and make these assignments, or try to make these assignments. I'll try to set hours to new hours, and then I'll set minutes to new minutes, just like that. It's the end of my if, and that's the end of my enter statement, or my enter method. So now what we've done is we've implemented our data integrity checks and set hours and set minutes, and we have our explicit constructor calling those set methods so that we know that we're applying those data integrity checks to any new values. And then we did the same thing here through enter, where we're validating the input that's coming through the keyboard. And we did that by storing these values in local variables so that we can check them, and we're making sure that any invalid values that we are storing in these local variables are not finding their way into our private data members. And so then you also need to do something similar for the read method, and I'll let you do that also, because that would be an opportunity where you could read some bogus information coming in off the disk or coming in off the network. But it should be similar to this, although remember that we're not reading the colon in the read method.